Go live in about 5 seconds. So ready? 5, 4, 3.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third in our series of Project 2049 virtual webinars focused on strategic competition in the Indo-Pacific. My name is John Gastroid, and I'm president of the Project 2049 Institute. And today's event is entitled Outweighing the CCP, the Role of Our European Allies in U.S.-China Strategic Competition. Now, before we launch into this all-star panel, I have the privilege of introducing my colleague, Colby Ferland, and he's going to walk you through how to maximize your viewing experience, how to ask questions, and enjoy this event to the maximum extent possible. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, Colby Ferland.
Great, thanks, John. So for our audience out there, if you RSVP'd for our event sometime in the last month, up to about 10 minutes ago, we sent all of you a personal email from our ask@project2049.net account that provides a link to watch just for your convenience. We'll be accepting questions for a live Q&A throughout the event. If you got that email, you can actually just reply right to that email and we'll start compiling questions. If you didn't RSVP and you're just joining now, that's perfectly fine. There are two ways to participate. So one, you can email us at ask@project2049.net, so ask@project2049.net. Or if you have a YouTube account and you're watching on YouTube, on the right side of the screen, you'll see a live chat box there with some, there's already some messages in there from our team. You can submit questions right to there and we'll contact you. So our team's going to put all those questions together and then we're going to provide them to our panelists here during the Q&A at the end of today's event. So two important announcements with that. One is we're collecting the questions throughout the event. So it's actually really helpful for us if you have a question in the moment to go ahead and submit it right away. We can start compiling and sorting them up and then provide them in an orderly fashion. So rather than waiting till the end, please go ahead and submit throughout the event. And the last thing is please provide your name and affiliation when asking questions. We love to announce it. Our team's going to try and coordinate and fill in that information, but we'll prioritize based on people that provide their name and affiliation for the questions. So with that, look forward to a great event, and I'm going to turn it over now to our chairman, Randall Schreiber.
Thanks, Colby, and thanks, John, and good morning. Good afternoon to our friends in Europe, and good evening to our friends tuning in from Asia. This is a discussion I've very much been looking forward to because although I worked on these issues in my capacity as Assistant Secretary of Defense recently, there is still much work to be done and still in need of good ideas. So very much looking forward to this expert panel. I will say one of the interesting things about being a political appointee who comes and goes, and sometimes there's passage of time in between service. Some issues you return to government and they look an awful lot like they did where you left them off. I've got to say this is an issue where I've seen a lot of progress. When I served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bush administration, we really did not have a shared view and we really were not in close alignment on these issues. I recall, in fact, spending time on trying to persuade our friends in the EU from lifting their arms embargo against China, something that I recall Chirac and Schrader were very much in favor of. Of course, that didn't happen. When I returned to government for this more recent service, I think we're both very much of the same view with respect to the economic challenges, technology, competition, even security issues. But now the hard part is really, given that alignment of views, how do we create practical means of cooperation? What's the right way to approach this as partners? What's the right division of labor, or where are the synergies? And so very much look forward to our panelists sharing views on that. And as John said, we do have an all-star panel. They're all three extraordinarily accomplished, so I'll just give top-line highlights here. And we'll go in the following order. First, Farkas, president of Farkas Global Strategies. And she has over 3 decades of experience working on national security policy in the executive branch, the legislative branch, and in the private sector. I think very relevant to this panel, she's worked on Asia-Pacific issues from the Senate Armed Services Committee, and she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia during the Obama administration. And she holds degrees from Franklin and Marshall and her PhD from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Next will be Shihoko Goto. She is Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and Senior Northeast Asia Associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Asia program there. She specializes in trade relations and economic issues across Asia. She has a great deal of experience as a journalist as well, over a decade writing about international economic policies and writing about the Asia markets. And she is fluent in both Japanese and French. She holds degrees from Waseda University, graduate degree, and a BA from Trinity College at Oxford University. And finally, we'll hear from Nicholas Rogal, who he recently joined about a year ago, the Institute for Strategy and Research, where he works on international development and part of their management team. He leads the development of IRSEM's international activities. He has held affiliations, research roles, and special advisor roles for the government of France, including Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has served in Japan, very well prepared to help us unpack these issues and help us develop creative ideas for moving practical cooperation forward. So with that, I'll kick off the panel and invite Dr. Farkas to make opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Randy, John, to the Institute for organizing this really important discussion, which I hope will cover really the global gamut, because this is not just an issue that pertains to China and Europe. It's really obviously a global concern. I will add to my biography that I also spent about a decade with the Senate Armed Services Committee working on Asia Pacific, diving in deeply to those areas that were, of course, of security concern. My perspective on the topic today, as I mentioned, is global. We're really, as now President Biden says repeatedly, in a standoff, democracies versus autocracies. And it's within this context that we have to understand what China's doing and how we need to approach China. And of course, China's not alone. Russia is also working very closely with China to challenge the international order. Russia is much more aggressive when it comes to challenging US democracy directly, but make no bones about it, the two countries are working together with very much aligned interests. They would like to see us go back to a sphere of influence system. They are not interested. Of course, there are some differences between the two countries, but they're not interested in using the international order the way the United States and our democratic allies and partners in Europe and Asia are, in order to prevent global wars, so world wars, and also, of course, to defend our democracies as well as the human rights of others, regardless of what country they live in. So I think that's the important context. I would say, I would agree with Randy, we've come a long way in terms of working together with Europe to counter China. The Europeans were slow to wake up to the threat in their backyard from Russia, and they were even slower when it came to understanding what China was doing. And I would say we shouldn't be too complacent, because all of Europe has not woken up. You can open your newspaper, or today open your laptop or your phone and see the latest news about Hungary inviting the Chinese government to build a Fudan University in Budapest. Now, of course, Hungary's still barely a democracy, and the mayor of Budapest is not entirely on board, so we'll see what happens. But needless to say, China has used its money, has used its incredible heft, the One Belt, One Road initiative, to make inroads into Europe. Some of these things we are trying to now help undo, like the fact that Montenegro has almost $1 billion debt that it needs to repay to China for a simple road to Serbia. But the Europeans are waking up. It's important to see that we've made great progress. Even the European people, I like two little data points, European and American people, but a German newspaper did a poll about what they should name in 2019, so about a little over a year ago, what they should name 2 new panda bears, and the poll result was Hong and Kong. So there's clear concern also in the publics. In the U.S., of course, we've seen, you know, the boycott Mulan movement, things of that nature, which are more broader than us wonky community. Most recently, I think it's important to note, because right now the G7 is meeting, that the US and we met with our European allies and made a lot of progress. It's not just words now. This US-EU dialogue vis-a-vis China is something serious. It started under the Trump administration because, as Randy alluded to, there was a lot of work that was done, for example, alerting our allies, not just in Europe, but across the world, about the threat posed by Huawei and the 5G initiative that China was spearheading. We now have very clear words coming out of Tony Blinken, who says, you know, we're more effective if we work 60% of the global economy, if we work the US, EU, as well as our democratic allies across the world, including Asia. And then we also have the EU, the head of the EU, saying we assess China the same way. So I think the EU-China investment deal is on hold, as we know. The EU and Europe have together slapped sanctions on the Chinese for human rights violations against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. And so there will be more concerted action. What I want to do now in the remaining time, and I haven't been timing myself very well, so someone will jump in if I've spoken too long, but I just want to say, basically, make 5 points about what does all this mean? What do we need to do? So first of all, obviously, we need to work together, all democracies, on bolstering military deterrence. This is something, of course, Randy and I know very well from our professional backgrounds, but it means defending territorial borders. It means defending sovereignty of all democratic nations, as well as undemocratic ones for that matter. That's at the crux of what the international order is all about. But in addition, and I'll get to the other parts of it, then in addition to that, freedom of air and sea navigation. This is critical because, as we know, China has been breaking international law left, right, and center when it comes to freedom of air and sea navigation. We also need to deter China from even thinking about anything pertaining to undersea cables, energy, transportation infrastructure. What we've seen with the Chinese investments, yes, it's economic, but it could also be used in a military situation to put us and our allies in harm's way. So we need to bolster our military deterrence, number one. Number two, we need to join forces in international fora like the UN to make sure that the rules of the road provide transparency, free, equal opportunity, and of course, protect human rights. Third, economically, we have to strengthen fair trade among ourselves, including, of course, export controls and accountability for China. We need to eliminate their use of forced text transfers, and espionage must be resisted, revealed, and punished. And of course, we need to increase R&D and defense industrial policy of the United States, but if we can do that with our allies across the world, we're better off. And then third, or rather that was third, fourth, we have to strengthen our democratic resilience via transparency, anti-corruption, education, and editorial board media. Here I'm getting at disinformation. And then finally, we really have a responsibility to the rest of the world. As I said in the beginning, this is not just a US-EU issue or a US-Japan, Taiwan, EU issue. It's a global issue. China is using its influence in developed countries that are weaker than us economically, politically, and militarily. So we need to help our friends in Africa, in Latin America, to make sure that they resist also these aggressive Chinese and unfair Chinese practices. And so that's really the bottom line, that we need to be better. We need to work better together. We need to bolster and defend our democracies, and we need to work internationally to do all of this and to make the world safe for democracy, to quote a former president. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Farkas. Ms. Goto, over to you.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this very timely discussion. It's it's wonderful to be here, and it's also very good to see that everyone's staying healthy as well. In discussing this issue of the role of Europe in US-China strategic competition, I want to start by stressing the fact that Northeast Asia, especially Japan and Europe, have similar interests and concerns, given that they are betwixt and between the world's two largest powers that are challenging the status quo of the Indo-Pacific region. I'd like to focus on two questions. First, to what extent wariness about Chinese regional hegemony, especially on the economic front, has led to a convergence of interests between Europe, particularly between the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, and Japan. And then the second question is whether they can actually cooperate in light of shared concerns about the need to hedge against Chinese coercion on the one hand, and uncertainties about the United States' continued commitment as a Pacific power. And as Europe looks to position itself in the world's most dynamic and populous region under the shadow of US-China tensions, it is looking to partners in the Indo-Pacific that share a common threat perception and also common goals. And Japan really can play a key role as a bridge builder for the three sides in sharing values and also in having particularly strong ties with the United States. I do want to point out, though, that the evolution of Japan's expectations for itself and global expectations for Japan have been closely linked to the rise of the China threat. And so if we turn to 2010, we see that Japan had fallen into third place economically in the global GDP rankings, falling third to China. And that was a big shock for Japan at the time. There had been much public denial about the numbers actually not reflecting the reality about Japanese technological competitiveness, Japan's industrial base, and the need for China to use Japanese capital. However, it is obvious that China is a critical manufacturing base, not just for Japan and the rest of Asia, but for the world. It is a supply chain hub, and it's also a tremendous market, has been and will continue to be. And the emergence of Chinese confidence, its growth in its worldview, and its global position, as well as rising nationalism, have also become much more apparent over the past decade as well. In light of that, Japan's position has evolved not to compete with China for hegemony head-on, but rather to focus much more on building up strength in numbers, building coalitions to push back against the Chinese regional threat, against the regional status quo, and to ensure, above all else, stability in the regional order. And Japan has been comfortable and has had the political will until about a year ago to take on the mantle of promoting a trading order. And Japan has obviously played a very key role in pushing for the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, to conclude even without the United States. And it's demonstrated through that its own appetite and leadership capabilities to push for multilateralism and a rules-based order within the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And the heightened US-China friction, coupled with a unilateralist approach under the Trump administration to trade, has given Tokyo the opportunity to get outside of the United States' shadow, to reach out to European partners, strengthen economic ties with those in Europe, and to pursue that route, not simply to further trade relations, but really to encourage European allies concerned about hedging against Chinese economic coercion and competition, and get them invested in the emerging vision for the Indo-Pacific landscape. And that narrative is particularly true for the United Kingdom. For Japan, Britain has really been its principal European partner, the biggest destination by far for Japanese FDA as a gateway to Europe. There had been over 1,000 Japanese companies based in the UK. And with the Japanese business community, with Keidanren, the Business Federation, at the forefront, was incredibly vocal, brutal even, in expressing its dismay about the government's decision to go forward with Brexit. And a 15-page letter by the government of Japan, by a 15-page letter by Keidanren to the people of Britain, and not just to Downing Street, was really seen as something really made clear Japan's frustration with the Brexit decision. We've already seen Japanese companies, from financial service companies to pharmaceutical conglomerates, preparing and now executing departure after Brexit. And they are furthering their continental European business strategy, especially looking towards the Netherlands. But the conclusion of Brexit has also, and the rising hawkish stance towards China has actually also led to a convergence of British and Japanese interests in the Indo-Pacific. So we see the Boris Johnson administration being eager to demonstrate its vision of a global Britain that is not simply a slogan, but actually has some meat to it. And it's really gone out of its way to seek out interests and opportunities outside of Europe. And Japan has been a natural partner to expand in Asia and into tapping into Asian growth for the benefit of the British economy. And indeed, the first post-Brexit bilateral trade agreement for the United Kingdom, Japan, which really did help push that global Britain narrative. And the UK's push to formally request joining CPTPP has furthered that vision of Britain going and expanding beyond the European borders. And the UK's interest in partnering with other countries to expand beyond the European borders comes at an opportune time for the Indo-Pacific. It's interesting to see when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, one of the big challenges, of course, is actually defining the geography of the Indo-Pacific. But we do have a concrete example of trade agreements and how it's defined under trade rules, especially under CPTPP. And the interest by the UK and its formal request to join has given this particular model of defining and giving an objective to the Indo-Pacific a number of benefits. One is that it has demonstrated the flexibility of open trade agreements. It also gives opportunity for countries to cooperate on a common agenda that could expand further on the trade front, but also beyond. And it goes beyond the concept of a security network and really provides this hanger to hang this comprehensive vision, an alternative roadmap, so to speak, to the regional order touted by Beijing, and also an ability of countries to cooperate on regional issues within the Indo-Pacific without either China or the United States. Turning to France, France's interest in the Indo-Pacific, of course, is not unexpected, and it was, of course, the first European nation to develop a comprehensive Indo-Pacific strategy, demonstrating its own interest in the region, notably in protecting its overseas territories. But it one of the weaknesses there of France is that it has a weak link with East Asia, Japan, as well as with South Korea, not just on the security front, but also economically too. I should point out that Japanese FDI to France is about a tenth of that to the United Kingdom at around 17 billion. It's actually below that of the Netherlands or Switzerland, Germany, or even Belgium. And so Tokyo has welcomed this reinvigorated French interest to really manifest itself as a Pacific power. And there are certainly common interests between Japan and France in ensuring security and stability in the Indo-Pacific region, and a shared commitment to balancing the China threat through multilateralism. But when we actually look at the European landscape and a continental European partnership in the Indo-Pacific, it would seem that Germany should be the natural partner for securing regional stability, but it's actually not. And although Germany has come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy, Germany, unlike France, has not traditionally viewed itself as a Pacific power, nor has it been a maritime power for obvious reasons. And like Japan, its military capabilities are actually hemmed in. But at the same time, Germany too has been clearly impacted by Chinese economic ambitions, hurting its own economic competitiveness. I'm sure you may have heard the story of Tappy, the robotic arm of T-Mobile. And about a decade ago, a Huawei engineer sneaking into the German telecommunications company's research center in Washington State, trying to sneak out with the robotic arm, Tappy, to get information about what made Tappy work. It's a funny story if it were not indicative of the escalation of industrial espionage and the threat of China to technology research. And of course, more recently, the Chinese appliance maker Midea acquiring the German robotics industrial group KUKA has made clear to German policymakers and heightened public awareness that China is, in fact, a tremendous economic competitor, and that German needs to be protected from the competitiveness of China, and that there are risks to accepting Chinese investments, and that there are risks of Chinese interference into German corporate governance, public policies, and indeed to Germany's national security as well. And so, trying to wrap up quickly here, moving forward, the definition of economic tensions and conflict with China has evolved rapidly over the last few years. And we've seen that in particular in this relationship between Tokyo and Washington. It had been that trade tensions had been the biggest sticking point for US-Japan relations. But now, with the latest Biden-Suga meeting last month, we see that economic relations are actually defined as partnerships, partnerships to push back against the China threat, to work together in developing a sphere of sphere of technology influence that can compete head-on with China. Japan is taking on a role to push back against Chinese economic coercion, and it's done that from its role in promoting multilateralism in trade, and we can expect that to continue further. There are, of course, differences about how exactly to reduce, if not wean off, from dependence on China. And there's certainly differences between Europe, the United States, and Japan on critical issues, including privacy and data governance. But there is this common concern about the cost of Chinese FDI, economic coercion, and threats to regional stability more broadly. And so, seen a trilateral partnership between the United States, Japan, and the EU in the WTO to push back against unfair trade practices by so-called non-market economies, which is really a not so couched way of pointing out China and its unfair trade practices. But COVID has also provided an opportunity to reimagine the economic order in the region. We are focused much more on building resilience and not simply focused on cost effectiveness. And we also see the much clearer ties between security and economic strategy, especially in the technology sphere. We have seen, but because the Indo-Pacific is so vaguely defined geographically, and it is such a disparate group of countries, we've already seen the emergence of so-called trusted partners in the shape of a travel bubble. I would argue that the Quad would fall into this category of trusted partner relationship as well. It's also rekindled commitment to specific governments and specific issues, such as Taiwan. There is also a consensus about what constitutes critical industries, critical supplies, such as semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and critical minerals. We've seen the Quad partner on together in developing and disseminating vaccines across the Indo-Pacific region. I believe that there is great potential for the European nations to partner with other countries, especially with Japan and the United States, to develop semiconductors, even as Europe is developing its own digital plan to actually become much more self-sufficient when it comes to chip production. The key here is, of course, identifying areas for selective and as much for strategic cooperation. So let me leave it at that.
Great, thank you. And joining us from France, Monsieur Regal. Your remarks, please.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And first of all, thank you to Randy and John for your invitation to this important webinar. I'm very happy to be with you. The theme of the meeting is important and there is a lot to say. So I would like to share my thoughts around 4 topics. Defining the terms of the question facing Europeans. Say a word about the interest shared between Europe and the US, and also about the differences. Recall what Europeans are doing, especially in the Indo-Pacific, but not only. And finally, share some ideas on what we could do together. So firstly, we need to ask ourselves the right questions. Is it for the Europeans to define their role in the Sino-American competition, as indicated in the title of the webinar, or to define a policy in reaction to the challenges posed by China, including in the Indo-Pacific, in consultation, of course, with their major partners in the region? It seems to me that the second option is the correct one, because Europeans do not always have the same interests. The NATO states, and they don't want to be forced to make a simplistic choice, to accept a black and white world that has entered a new Cold War, as Mike Pompeo invited us to do not long ago. But Europeans, as it has been said, are no longer naive. They do not believe China is a country like any other. In March 2019, the Europeans redefined their vision of their relation with China, qualified as a partner in some cases, for instance, to fight climate change, an economic competitor in any case, and a systemic rival by promoting another model of governance. So to answer the question put to this panel, it is also necessary to distinguish between European states and the European Union. So major European states, in particular France and the UK, have specific interest and level of engagement in the Indo-Pacific. As for France, it has 1.7 million nationals in its overseas territories in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and the French EEZ represent 9 million square kilometers. It deploys also around 7,000 troops on a permanent basis, not to mention regular deployment of forces from Europe. And the UK has also territories, tiny, of course, Diego Garcia and Pitcairn, and has recently re-engaged in the region diplomatically and militarily. But for many other European countries, the Indo-Pacific region appears remote and of lesser strategic importance in view of the growing challenges faced in the east and south of Europe. So, however, because China has become a world power that poses increasing challenges, the Europeans, even on the continent, the Europeans, because of also they consider that a crisis or conflict in the Indo-Pacific will very directly affect European interest. The Europeans are now engaging in a new comprehensive policy toward China, combining diplomatic, economic, and security aspect based on analysis of their own interest. So the second point is, what are the shared interests and the Euro-American differences? Shared interests dominate, and I will only briefly review this, because Europe is a unique political construction, fragile in many aspects, and facing many internal and external challenges. Multilateralism and international law are essential instruments for its security and prosperity. It draws its strength from its economy, its high level in science and innovation, and its ability to set standards in multilateral format. Europe is not a federal state, much less an empire. It embodies the rule of law against those for whom might is right, those who are challenging an international order based on law and norms, notably Russia and China. This is particularly the case in the South and East China Seas, where China calls into question fundamental principles of international governance, in particular the peaceful settlement of disputes, the respect of agreements concluded, and freedom of navigation and overflight in international spaces. But the policies pursued by the Trump administration has also revealed the differences that may exist between us, especially with regard to multilateralism, consultation among allies, and respect for diplomatic forms and norms. Thus, the US-China trade war did not correspond to the way in which the Europeans intended to solve the problems of a comparable nature they are having with China. Viewed from Europe, the Sino-American competition is also part of a struggle for world leadership, which gives it a critical dimension that does not exist in the Sino-European systemic rivalry. It does not mean that the Europeans wish to adopt a position of neutrality. Quite the contrary, I think. But simply that the level of the stakes is not exactly the same. So, third point, what are the Europeans doing? So the webinar is very short and no time for developing this point, but I will give some example of the kind of measures Europeans are implementing today. Because of economic activities and espionage, technical espionage by China in Europe. So we have, at the initiative of France and Germany, put in place a new mechanisms for screening foreign investment in Europe. And I think that's also the way we have to think about the convergence between the US and Europe. We are all putting in place a lot of measures in order to protect our interests, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but in our own continent. And we have a lot to share concerning these mechanisms and measures. But also in the Indo-Pacific, just to mention a few examples, France is deploying vessels in the South China Sea regularly, exercising its right to freedom of navigation and overflight, and the UK followed suit more recently. Germany is expected to do the same this year by deploying a frigate, and the Europeans have put in place a so-called coordinated maritime presence mechanism that could potentially apply in the Indo-Pacific in the future. This European presence helped to show that fait accompli are not fait accepted. The joint note verbal addressed by France, Germany, and the UK recently to the UN Commission on the limit of the continental shelf to challenge China's obligation of UNCLOS obligation constitute another way to defend the rule of international governance. On the economic front, the EU-Asia connectivity strategy adopted in 2018 and aimed in particular in responding to Belt and Road Initiative also constitutes a European contribution to international governance by supporting connectivity projects that are sustainable, transparent, financially bearable, and free from any ambition of subordination of the beneficiary countries. The increased participation of the EU and its main member states to multilateral cooperation fora in the Indo-Pacific is perhaps one of the most important and least known avenues for progress. This helps to support multilateralism, which represents a form of soft coercion of major powers, especially China. It promotes capacity building of the most vulnerable countries to power politics. France has recently engaged in that direction, and last year was accepted as a full member of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, is now development partner of ASEAN. It's participated to the South Pacific Defense Minister meeting since its creation in 2013. Wants to participate to ADM Plus activities and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of possibilities to participate in all these fora, which help capacity building activities in the region. And I think that's also a movement where other European member states are willing to go, and the EU too. The same dynamic can be seen in terms of military cooperation. As you know, we are sending capital ships in the region, nuclear craft carrier, recently a nuclear attack submarine. The Brits will do the same this month and in the following months. We have organized recently, France has organized quite important military naval exercise in the Gulf of Bengal with or Australian, Indian, American, and Japanese partners. That's also a way to show that we are not just following, but also acting and leading in some cases. That's the case also for Paul Mill, military Paul Mill negotiation formats. France had, it has been a little bit mentioned, but France has, with Japan, a 2+2 ministerial meeting every year since 2014. That's quite important because it helps develop regular cooperation, as you know very well. When you have this kind of format, that means that all the bureaucratic machinery is at work and has to deliver every year, and we have to show how we are progressing in the way of our cooperation. It is important also to mention, it has been mentioned in the introduction of this seminar, that we are also in some cases showing the way. For instance, France has proposed to India and Australia to build up a trilateral format of cooperation, and now it works. It works because we have convinced India to go that way, and with Australia, and now we have the regular discussion. There are regular discussion at the Secretary General level of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now at the Minister of Foreign Affairs level. So that's quite important also. And in the field of in military field, it worked like that more and more. At the European level, at the EU level, it has to be mentioned, recalled that last month, the European Foreign Affairs Council has adopted guidelines on strategy, EU strategy on cooperation in the Pacific. So main guidelines in some area which are quite traditional. So ocean governance, cooperation in multilateral fora, connectivity, climate change, health, defense and security. And it has tasked the European External Action Service and the Commission to implement, to propose a strategy before next September. So it means that not just more engaged and more important European states are more and more active, but also at the European level, I mean, France, Germany, and Netherlands in particular, has pushed forward and encouraged or the EU to go that way. My last point would be on to describe or to propose some avenues for progress. My first point is about the Taiwan crisis. That is something new for many Europeans to understand that a crisis, an open crisis, or even a conflict could happen in between the China, Taiwan, and maybe with US involvement. And my point is that there is no way European or the EU could be distant bystanders. They would be forced to take side because they have also their own interest. More than 8,000 national citizens living in Taiwan, huge investment stocks, more than 30 billion, trade worth $60 billion in 2020. But the problem is not economic. Economy is not a driver for being engaged politically and strategically. It has been mentioned before. Economy is not the key element for being engaged in the region. If it would be the case, Germany would have been the more engaged strategic actors in the region, which it is not. No, the question would be political and strategic for Europeans. Could Europe witness without flinching an attack on such an exemplary democracy? To do nothing would risk jeopardizing transatlantic relations and those forged with the major regional powers in the Indo-Pacific. Transatlantic solidarity could be put to the test in the Indo-Pacific, and this is not yet fully understood in Europe. So my point is not to develop this point today, but to say that I think there is avenue for more discussion between officials, of course, but also between think tanks to discuss all these war games, crisis scenarios, contingency planning, just to help our European partners understand that they would be forced to take side. It would be mandatory to take side just because transatlantic solidarity would be at risk if they do nothing. My second point is about economic security. We have seen the use of China is made of its dominant position in the production of rare earth minerals in 2010 with Japan, and now exerting economic pressure on Australia. As General Petraeus said, the world has entered the age of the weaponization of everything. So in this backdrop, against this backdrop, Japan's ambition to set up an economic security strategy make me think that there is the room for more exchanges between the two sides of the ocean, and also with our partners in the Indo-Pacific for discussing question of economic security, question of economic resilience. The recent supply chain resilience initiative which Japan took with India and Australia show the way. My last point would be to say that in terms of climate change, there is also room for acting together. And in particular, in the field of climate security, which is an important element for all Indo-Pacific countries, which are very vulnerable, among the most vulnerable in the world. So the Indo-PACOM in 2011 took a very important initiative, the Pacific Environmental Security Forum, which is not sufficiently focused on climate change, which is not an organization, just a forum. I think there would be it would be possible to imagine this forum to be changed into an organization. I think Europe would support that. It would be a way to re-engage the US in the region. You know, the climate skepticism of the Trump administration left, and particularly in the Pacific Ocean, and to show the way, to show American generosity and its fight for common good in that field of climate security will be also a way to be re-engaged and to be followed by others. And I think Europe would strongly support that. I'll finish it. I'm sorry for being too long.
Great. Well, thanks to all our panelists. We could have allotted more time to all of you. I really appreciate everybody's thoughtful remarks. I think we might have time for a couple questions, Colby. Is that right? I'll turn it over to you. I know the team's been compiling them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Randy. We've got a bunch of questions in. So to make best use of our time, I've been trying to kind of group them into categories, and we like to recognize as many people as we can who take the time to submit questions. So let me start with the two big areas, and then after we get through those two, we'll two big areas, we'll do them one at a time, and then after we get through that, we'll hit as many others as we can before time's expired. So the first big kind of question category is on the kind of economic, diplomatic, multilateral avenues and capabilities for cooperation and the efficacy of that, and talking about issues like human rights, climate change, et cetera. So let me read out a few questions from our audience, and then we can kind of pick that apart for a few minutes before moving on to the military side. So we have Guofu Yang from Voice of America. He says, the group of 7 nations is considering a U.S. proposal to counter what the White House sees as China's economic coercion. Do you think G7 or even the Quad would be effective platforms to address China issues? That's question 1. Question 2, Gerrit van der Wees, George Washington University's Elliott School. He says, how can the U.S., Europe, and other allies build strength in numbers in pushing back against China on issues such as Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Tibet, and Taiwan in the United Nations? And the last related question on this theme is from Amelia Duell from George Washington University. How can countries effectively counter the economic enticements of the Belt of One Belt, One Road? And what role do non-PRC bilateral trade deals, most favored nation status, and foreign direct investment play in opposing Chinese influence? So I'll leave that open. In our next round of questions, we'll talk about some military aspects.
Maybe we could start with Dr. Farkas, go back to basically stay in the same order. I see each of these questions sort of touching each of you. Thanks.
Okay, on the first one, the answer is yes. So I think the question was, is the G7 and is the European Union are these the right, and the Quad, are these the right fora to cooperate to counter China? So yes. I forget what the middle one was, but on countering economic enticements, I think this is where it's really important for our countries, that is to say, all the democratic countries to come together and come up with our own aid packages, things that we can do to help also really highlight the vulnerabilities that these countries face. I mean, just pointing to Bangladesh, of course, that's the famous one where the Chinese pretty much control their port now. But more recent, Montenegro's example, the price tag, shedding more transparency and getting the word to the people in those countries. Because in the Hungarian example, if the Hungarian people aren't concerned, then Viktor Orban may well have his way, and you'll have this Fudan University, which is basically a Chinese government institution, having a huge influence in the middle of Central Eastern Europe. By the way, in a country where they used to host the Soros-funded Central Eastern European University. So that message will not be lost to democratic countries, I don't think. So I'll leave it at that.
Great.
So perhaps I can talk about two of the three. One was about economic, pushing back against Chinese economic coercion. The other one was about BRI. When it comes to economic coercion, pushing back against China by publicly shaming them is working. And initially expected a lot more rallying around Australia's fight, fighting back against it. We hadn't actually seen that. I think that if we had seen a much more vocal, united stance, uniting like-minded countries with Australia, I think that would have been a powerful message. But would it have changed Chinese action itself? That is not going to be the case, but it would have strengthened the unity amongst the Quad and the allies of Australia as well. On the BRI issue, we know that dollar for dollar, we cannot match China's grand development. It goes beyond a development assistance strategy. It's big economic vision. But what we can say is that BRI has expanded far beyond the scope of simply providing aid, and also as a means to deal with Chinese excess capacity. There are other visions that are coming out of China as well. I'm thinking particularly about the digital currency roadmap that China has come up with. The United States and other countries are very reluctant to really match what the Chinese ambitions are in that area. This is something that the pioneering country will have a leg up in determining the landscape of the digital currency future. So I think there is opportunity for greater G7 coordination in developing a roadmap for digital currency growth as well. And finally, there has been a lot of soul searching amongst the Bretton Woods institutions about not only economic assistance, but also representation within their institutions as well. And I do think that it should be an opportunity for greater reflection within the IMF, the World Bank, as well as in the US, UN organizations as well, about equity and greater representation and re-establishing the goals of multilateral cooperation as well.
Yes, just a few remarks. On the G7, it has been used already as a vehicle for sending messages to China concerning the freedom of navigation and overflight. So it is a good format also for sending strong messages in a group manner. On Xinjiang, for instance, we have already reacted strongly at different levels, at national level, the EU level. The European Parliament reacted very strongly too. Question, I mean, the way to understand this question and the reaction we have to implement is to consider that working on the resilience of our own supply chain is also a way to protect our interest, and then also to react and to the challenges posed by China. So the direction has been given at the European level that we want to go that way. We want we felt very vulnerable during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then there will be a lot of consequences because of all these vulnerabilities, and it will go beyond being autonomous in the field of health only. So I think there will be, because of this vulnerability, a wish to go quite far, and in cooperation with Japan, with the US and other partners.
So here we've got this amazing opportunity. We've actually run to the end of our time. We have a huge stock of questions, and so we want to respect your time. If you need to go, please know we appreciate that. If you have time to take one more, we'd love to pose a couple of these, just because so many people have taken the time to send in notes to Colby and the team. And additionally, we'd also love to farm a few of these out to you and see if you might be able to just type a few answers that we can send them back to those who have taken the time to log in. But for those of you that need to drop off, we understand. But for those of you that can stay, I think Colby's got one more that really targeted. And again, we'll let you make those decisions here real quickly before you ask a question, Colby.
Great, thanks. Well, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, again, please feel free if you need to jump off. I do see one more kind of big categorical question and weighing in on the military side of it. So I think I'll go through that, and we'll take it just like we did the last one, and then can wrap up. But yeah, thanks to Jan Kleim and Aaron Opel. I've got your questions. We'll try and feed them and answer after. I don't think we'll have time to address them at this in this round, but I would like to address more on the military capability side. So we have a question in from Scott Harold, senior political scientist at RAND. He says, what military capabilities, if any, would be the most impactful for European partners to contribute to a regional contingency involving China in the Indo-Pacific? He said, I would appreciate specifics on ISR, its intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, critical munitions, space resiliency, BMD, I believe, ballistic missile defense, Atlantic anti-submarine warfare to free U.S. subs, or is the greatest European contribution to Indo-Pacific security it would be Europe doing more to defend itself, thereby freeing up some U.S. capabilities to be reassigned. And then in very similar notes to that, we have Ben Lewis at GW. If the U.S. chose to come to the defense of Taiwan in the event of invasion, would European powers be willing to assist against the PRC? I think Dr. Regard spoke to that earlier, actually. And finally, Gavin Stark, a research intern at Global Taiwan Institute. What effect, if any, do you see the upcoming European Navy transits of the South China Sea having on cross-strait deterrence? Do Royal Navy or Deutsche Marine vessels merely show solidarity, or could they have a combat role in a Chinese invasion of Taiwan scenario or other Indo-Pacific contingency? So that's a lot there. I know Dr. Harold had a few different areas of interest. I can repeat anything, and other than that, I will leave it. I'm here to repeat, and other than that, I'll let you take it.
I mean, I'll start, since that seems to be the order that we do it. Although, you know, I suspect Randy is best positioned really to answer this. Look, I think with regard to what military capabilities the Europeans can offer, all of them are welcome and all of them will help, but they will not be as important as the solidarity component. What's most important is having the democratic world, all of our allies, European, those also in the Indo-Pacific, aligned together, saying you cannot take a country by force and therefore effectively annex it the way that Russia has annexed Ukraine. The UN already spoke very clearly on Ukraine. Now, we didn't all take direct military action. Everything is a case-by-case basis. We have a more or less of a guarantee to Taiwan, again, case-by-case basis, but it's likely that I was heartened by what Dr. Rigaud said, because I do think he's probably right, even though Europeans generally don't understand at this juncture in time that they have a dog in that fight, if you will. So I think the most important thing would be the political solidarity, because from that will flow a lot of other assistance, not necessarily military.
I just want to add one thing, just to also echo what Dr. Rigaud said about the stakes are actually not the same for the European countries when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, the strategic importance of protecting, defending Taiwan is palpable, and it's going to be this litmus test, not just for Japan, but for the region at large. And not only the actions, but also the words coming out from the various European governments, as well as from the European itself, not just by the Taiwanese government, but also by Tokyo in particular, but also across the region. So this will be that real litmus test of European, as well as the US commitment to regional security as well.
I totally agree with what has been said before. I think in case of open crisis or conflict in the region, particularly involving China and Taiwan and the US, the political commitment would be as important as the military one. No one can expect European countries or the EU to send forces in the region at the level of the conflict that would take place. But of course, we can imagine also that some asset could be sent in the field, just to show solidarity, and and we have shown that some countries have capabilities to send forces. For instance, just to give you an example, I know quite well, and because of the capability of French Air Force to resupply fighters, we will soon be able to, as it has been said by the chief of the Air Force, to send something like 20 Rafale fighters in East Asia. So if needed, so that's not to say that that's a big stuff, but that's important to show also that we can side with our allies if needed and if decided. But the question I wanted to point out in my previous intervention is that when you take side politically, you have to pay the price. No one can imagine that in case of open conflict in the region and European to take side, China won't react. Of course, cyber war will be open at that time. There will be also economic consequences and a lot of consequences. So, of course, my point is that that's the kind of scenario many Europeans don't want to imagine and think about. That's just my point. And we need to together. and with our partners and allies. Because it is important if Europeans and the EU take side. It counts for the US, it counts for all our Indo-Pacific partners. Of course, it is it would be also another problem for China. So I think we don't have to summarize what the European can do in just in military terms, even if we can do something. But it is a quite short-sighted perception of the reality. In time of crisis or open conflict, all count, and all political position, of course, will matter.
Great, thanks. With that, I believe I'll turn it to our chairman to wrap up the event. I know we still have more incoming questions. We're very grateful for that, and we're going to do our best to follow up after the event and try and maybe connect you with some of those answers. And we'll try and do right by everyone who submitted questions. Very grateful for that, Randy.
Well, thank you again to our distinguished panelists. We obviously only were able to scratch the surface, but more work ahead for all of us. I think at a minimum, we set the table here for a lot of provocative and thoughtful points that we can follow up on and unpack further. So thank you again for helping us explore this topic, and we look forward to the work ahead. And wish everyone a good evening, good afternoon, and good day.